All right, thank you. I think we are live and ready to get started. Um, Good morning, everyone. For the record, my name is Tyler Klimas. I'm the Executive Director of the Cannabis Compliance Board. Today is Tuesday, January 19th, 2021. The time is 10:05. We are here at the Grant Sawyer Building in Las Vegas. This is the time and place for a workshop to discuss proposed changes to the Nevada Cannabis Compliance Board Regulations NCCR 5 and 6, as well as to discuss the need for any changes to NCCR 12.065. That discussion will be led by Member Young. We're joined today in person by the Chair of the Cannabis Compliance Board, Michael Douglas, here at the office. Member Nylander, Member Merritt, and Member Young are joining us all by Zoom. Member Durrett will join us shortly. Deputy Bala, has this workshop been properly noticed in accordance with the public meeting law?
Yes, it has, sir.
Thank you. Well, with that, before we move on to public comment and then to the proposed regulation changes, Mr. Chairman, would you like to provide any remarks or opening remarks or make any statements?
Now we just have a full plate today, looking at NCCR 5120, 5130, 6025, as to fingerprints, as to renewal registration cards, and collection of fees and cost at an hourly rate for certain functions, and then as to requirements of packaging notice. We appreciate those who are on the line today to give us some input. And that's what the workshops are about. So I will not comment any further so we can get on with the business and see what we have in terms of comments and from the public, either written or in person.
Great, thank you, Chair. So with that, we will move on, get started, and open with the public comment. In compliance with Governor Sisolak's Emergency Directive Number 6, dated March 22nd, 2020, this workshop is being conducted by means of electronic communication. Public comments were asked to be submitted online to be read into the record. Any comments received from this point on will either be read at the closing public comment period and/or posted online following the workshop. As a reminder, all public comments received will be posted in their entirety. So with that, we do have a few public comments. Ms. Bonner, I believe you are prepared to read those into the record, so please begin.
Hi, good morning. So the first public comment is from Pejman Beatty. Clark Natural Medicinal Solutions submits this letter in support of the repeal of Regulation 12.065. The labeling requirement in Regulation 12.065 is unnecessary and it creates an undue hardship on cultivators. Treating cannabis with ionized radiation is safe as it helps prevent mold and aspergillus from developing post-testing. This serves as a benefit to the consumer and has been used throughout the world, and this treatment is actually a requirement of all exported, imported produce. Radiation has a spectrum from basic light bulbs to computed topography, and hence the language is not clear to its clear application. Our company supports repealing Regulation 12.065 because the notice warning language is not scientifically supported and thereby misleading to consumers. Thank you for your consideration of this matter. Clark Natural Medicinal Solutions urges the CCB to repeal Regulation 12.065. The next public comment we have is from Chow Sung Tung with G3 Labs. Nevada, being an agreement state, assigns all activities related to the use of radioactive material to the purview of Department of Health and Human Services, Division of Public and Behavioral Health. NRS 459 clearly designates such responsibility. NCCR section 12.065 does not correlate with and therefore supplants that regulatory authority in Nevada. Assuming NCCR section 12.065 invokes the NAC 459.068 definition, the text implies permission to use ionizing radiation, that is gamma rays and X-rays, alpha and beta particles, high-speed electrons, neutrons, and other nuclear particles to treat cannabis. This wide application ignores the reality that the sum of these, quote, radiations, such as alpha and beta particles and neutrons, are impractical for any treatment irradiation of cannabis. It also creates coordination difficulties for the governing regulatory authority. while a radiation control program, thus the radiation producing machines, would be under the purview of the Department of Health and Human Services Division of Public and Behavioral Health. No regulatory specifications exist within that department for radiation irradiation of cannabis. Nevada Department of Agriculture refers irradiation of seeds to FDA, NRS 587.889, subsection 2K. At a glance, Department Food and Drug Administration, FDA, does not specify certain requirements applicable to radiation of food and food additives. However, the irradiation of cannabis is not addressed under any of those requirements. At the designated extremely low dose, radiation is very effective to reduce or eliminate microorganisms that may harm the consumer. The implied assumption that treating cannabis with radiation irradiation will result in harmful residues is unfounded. Currently, the ionizing radiation for the treatment of food is limited to gamma rays, electrons, and X-rays. There are also radio frequency radiations, including microwave frequencies, ultraviolet radiation, and pulse light. All these treatments, when used per regulations, are considered safe without harmful effects to consumers. Notice this product contains ingredients that have been treated with irradiation. This notice is very misleading. 21 CFR 179.26b delineates a threshold for irradiation dose levels before a labeling requirement is applicable. NCCR 12.065 applies the FDA food labeling requirement to irradiated cannabis without any dose level threshold. As such, the notice not only provides zero added value for public health protection, it'll falsely create a perception of potential harm. Additionally, FDA does not require that individual ingredients in multi-ingredient foods, e.g. spices, be labeled. Cannabis production products such as candies, drinks, and lotions are all multi-ingredient products. Okay. The next public comment is from Amanda Connor. I'm writing on behalf of my client, Integral Cultivation LLC and CCLV Manufacturing Center LLC. Integral Cultivation LLC and CCLV Manufacturing Center LLC respectfully request that the following language be stricken from NCCR 12.065. They include a copy of 12.065. The language should be stricken for the reasons set forth in the petition submitted by RadSource Technologies. Thank you for your time and consideration. The next public comment is from Tim Fitzpatrick with White Cloud Botanicals. White Cloud Botanicals has recently acquired the RadSource 420 system. This decision was made so our patients and adult use clients would benefit from our cannabis product being clean and free of harmful yeast, mold, and bacteria. We feel that adding additional labels for no reason could be misleading to the public and should not be required in the future. Please contact me if you have any questions. And the last public comment we received is from Will Adler with Silver State Government Relations. Post-harvest treatment of cannabis is an ever-changing yet promising field of growth for many cultivation facilities. Post-harvest treatments include irradiation and sonic treatment, as well as the handling and packaging of the cultivated products into their proper lots prior to cannabis testing. In Nevada, there is a need for more language around the post-harvest treatment of cannabis, the equipment used to do so, and the effects of the post-treatment on the cannabis. This equipment has a place in remediating cannabis of minor to moderate microbial outbreaks a harvest may experience. Having said that, it's not unreasonable to ask that cannabis which has been treated with one of these post-harvest machines be labeled as such to indicate to patients and consumers it required some sort of secondary treatment prior to sale. If one does not do that, then the Cannabis Compliance Board is not doing its best to inform consumers of the quality of the product in the cannabis market. At this time, it would be reasonable to have all products which required secondary treatment to provide some sort of notification to the consumer. It may not be the Redura sign nor the language currently required by NCCR, but possibly some symbol the CCB develops to indicate a needed post-harvest treatment on that flower. Additionally, if this equipment is allowed to be used by cultivators in the normal growth and production cycle, that equipment should be available for the same cultivator to use in whatever means they see fit. This includes the possible use of any of these machines to toll or to treat products from another cultivation facility. This would be similar to how cultivators sell previously failed product for remediation to a production company. The ability to toll or to use the machines to treat another facility's products would broaden the availability to secondary treatment to more than the cultivators who can, quote, afford the latest in post-harvest treatment, but rather have available to anybody who wishes to pay for this service.
Great, thank you, Ms. Bonner. So with that, we'll move on to, I'm sorry.
Oh, okay. I thought you might have something else. Okay.
Got it. Thank you. So moving on to agenda item number 2, these are the proposed amendments and additions to the Nevada Cannabis Compliance Board regulations. I'll now turn it over to Deputy Director Michael Miles to go through the 3 changes under agenda item number 2.
Good morning. My name is Michael Miles. I'm the Deputy Director of the Cannabis Compliance Board. I'm going to go through the proposed changes, which are mostly housekeeping in nature, to Regulation 5 and 6 separately. CCB staff is here to answer any questions that members may have on either of the changes. NCCR 5.120 is being updated to clarify that any person without limitation who wishes to own less than 5% of a cannabis establishment must apply for a registration card absent a waiver pursuant to NCCR 5.125. NCCR 5.130 is being updated to include titles of various executive positions that must obtain a cannabis executive agent registration card. Again, these are just housekeeping items. With that, myself and Chief Staley are here to answer any questions that board members may have on the proposed changes to Regulation 5. Seems we have no questions, so great, on to Regulation 6. NCCR 6.025 is a rewrite of the time and effort billing regulation. The rewrite was done to clarify what the CCB was already billing a licensee for. Again, I want to stress that the rewrite encompasses and clarifies what the licensees are already being billed for. The only addition to the regulation is that the CCB will be billing licensees for travel expenses, such as airfare and hotel, if and only if travel is necessary for an investigation. An example of necessary travel would be flying to Canada to interview an executive of a company that is attempting to purchase a licensee. We felt that the regulation as drafted was outdated and was in need of updating and clarifying language. With that, I'm happy to answer any questions that board members may have on the proposed changes to Regulation 6.
Any questions from board members?
None.
Okay, great. I'll turn it back to Director Cannabis to continue with the agenda.
Thank you. Pretty straightforward changes for agenda item number 2. So now we will move on to agenda item number 3. This is the discussion on potential changes or amendments to NCCR 12.065. This discussion is going to be led and chaired by Member Young of the Cannabis Compliance Board, and will include a presentation by RadSource as well. So with that, Member Young, if you're ready, I will turn it over to you.
Great. Well, thank you. And I'd like to thank everyone for being here today. I'd like to thank the public comments. I'll be honest, I wish that we had had more comment from the consumer. Most of it was generated from the industry, which is still very much appreciated. My understanding is that RadSource has a PowerPoint presentation that they would like to give today, and I thought that would be a reasonable place to start. I would like to say if we could possibly hold on comments until maybe they're done with their PowerPoint so that we can maybe ask questions related to that. And I've also asked Kara Cronkite to make a couple of comments regarding the current, how we test, the cannabis product in regards to what is tested for and, what kind of contamination issues that we have as it relates to going to the labeling process. Anyways, at this point, I think it'd be reasonable to turn it over to RadSource in regards to their PowerPoint presentation if they are ready.
Good morning. Excuse me just one second. Good morning, Dr. Young, Chairman Douglas, members of the Cannabis Compliance Board, and Director Clymas. For the record, I'm attorney Kimberly Maxim Russian, appearing on behalf of RadSource Technologies. Joining me today are my co-counsel, Mr. Joel Schwartz, and on behalf of RadSource, Mr. Will Hartman, the CEO, Mr. George Terry, the Executive Vice President, Nathan Kroger, Vice President of Sales, Jeff Duvall, Account Executive, and Justin Chernowski, Head of Research and Development. We'd like to begin by thanking the CCB for your consideration of RadSource's petition to repeal Regulation 12.065. In anticipation of today's workshop, RadSource submitted an introductory memorandum to the CCB, which provided information about RadSource and its instrumentality. It also provided information about the utilization, the safe utilization of ionizing radiation to decontaminate various products, including cannabis. Most important, the information demonstrates the value of RadSource's RS-420 line in preventing mold and aspergillus from developing post-harvest following testing. In further support of RadSource's position, we also submitted opinion letters from academics familiar with the technology, as well as information regarding a study that was conducted in Nevada, which confirms the benefits and safety of RadSource's decontamination process of cannabis. Collectively, we respectively submit that the scientific evidence demonstrates the value of the said processes and the lack of necessity in requiring a noticing label such as that contained in Reg 12.065. At this time, Dr. Young, I'd like to turn it over to my colleague, Mr. Schwartz, who will provide you with an overview of the PowerPoint presentation.
Great, thank you. Thank you for that introduction. And yeah, let's turn it over and watch the PowerPoint.
Dr. Young and members of the CCB, thank you very much for your time today and your consideration. We've prepared, as Ms. Maxim Russian said, a lengthy presentation, both in a slideshow that's an overview of a lot of the written materials and the written materials themselves. I thought that perhaps it would be most efficient with our time if I addressed what we believe are the main points that are covered in the written materials in the slideshow, and I'll make reference to specific slides, but we will have the entire PowerPoint available to you if it is not already. With that, I will actually highlight certain materials that are within this PowerPoint. And if you have any questions, of course, please feel free to stop me at any time and let me know if there are specific questions you'd like me to address as we move through this presentation. The first of, there's four main points that I think are covered within the slideshow PowerPoint presentation, which I will see if I can't get up on the screen to share with everybody, and that are also addressed in the written materials that we'd like to make sure that everybody has in mind as you're considering the request to repeal this particular regulation. And I hope that everybody is able to see the PowerPoint at this time. Okay. So the first of the points, and this is addressed in a lot of these introductory slides, and I hope that you've seen enough materials at this point that you're familiar with generally who RadSource is, what RadSource does, not just in the cannabis space, but in a variety of industries with its X-ray technology. So rather than repeating what's there, the main point here is that ionizing radiation in general and RadSource X-ray machines specifically are a safe and effective means for decontaminating cannabis flower. And I think that if there are a couple of things I'd like you to take a look at in particular, and I will go there now, in slides 15 through 19, what you have, and this is also Exhibit 7 to the written materials, is a paper that was published in the Frontiers of Pharmacology by Arno Hazekamp. And the Hazekamp paper is particularly, is particularly instructive as to the necessity of decontamination of cannabis flower, particularly in medicinal marijuana, but also in just any marijuana product that is going to be consumed by the public, because of the issues with, despite everybody's best intentions and techniques and practices, it is almost impossible to have a completely sterile environment in which you're not going to get any microbes or pathogens. And so it is a necessity to be able to treat and remove those to prevent them from growing over time. I think that at this point, one thing that probably needs to be addressed is, and I believe, Dr. Young, you had indicated that Ms. Cronkite probably will also talk about this, is how and when harvested product is actually tested and what the testing regimen is. And the reality is that there isn't later testing. So there you have your initial testing to make sure that you have no more than a maximum count of colony forming units, which are, that's CFUs or the contaminants. But there isn't a later testing to determine whether after initial harvest and testing, this product hasn't grown more microbes and pathogens. So it is critical that you have an initial treatment that is as effective as possible to reduce to the maximum extent possible the contaminants in the harvested flower. So going back to the slides 15 through 17 discussing or covering the Haskamp paper, his conclusion was at that time that ionizing radiation is probably the ideal means by which you should be doing this decontamination, and that in particular ionizing radiation is a safe and effective way to do this. Now, fortunately, we don't just have that as a data point. That is, of course, a very useful data point. But the other thing that has happened is in early 2020, there was a specific study that was requested by the Department of Taxation Marijuana Enforcement Division from one of the licensees, that being Flower One, using a rad source machine specifically to test lots of harvested flower. And the results of that were highly favorable, both from that it is effective, but also that it is safe. And when we're talking about safe, let's be more specific here. Safe it has, I think, 3 components. Safe meaning, number one, you're not negatively affecting the important chemical compounds that are within the cannabis product to begin with. So you're not destroying or altering, in particular, the THC, but other chemical components as well. And that is not the case. Number 2, safe would be you're not creating new and potentially harmful compounds. And that has also been analyzed and tested, and that has proven to be not the case. And Dr. Tung, I think his public comment actually gets into that a little bit more and has done some of that testing as well. And the third part, and I think we're all on the same page here, but let's just make sure, is when it comes to ionizing radiation in particular, there seems to be a misunderstanding and a concern about the possibility of something becoming radioactive. And that is simply just not true. There are slides within the presentation, there are materials within the written materials addressing the fact that what is happening here is you are hitting living tissue, which would be the pathogens, microorganisms, and killing them, but you can't kill that which is already dead, which is the harvested flower. So any concern about radioactivity is just unfounded and based upon a misunderstanding of the basic science involved. So that concludes my discussion for now of the first main point of everything that we have presented here. And one of the main points that, quite frankly, was litigated between RadSource and the Department of Taxation with regard to the ban that had been put in place on the RadSource machines, which is it's safe and effective. So moving on to then the second main point of all of this, which is that although RadSource has provided a great deal of material. It provided that material to the court in the litigation, and it's provided the CCB with a lot of that material. And I think that it's also in some of the public comment materials that have been presented by RadSource competitors, Zeal and Willow in particular. Although RadSource technology, X-rays in general, and RadSource technology are safe and effective for food, we are not dealing with a food product in this regulation or in this market in general. Cannabis, if we're going to start with a foundational, intellectually honest position, cannabis is not food. Cannabis is a drug. If we are going to look at how the FDA handles drugs specifically, you could take a look at what's slide 42, and I'll go to it. And you can also take a look at Exhibit 19 to the written materials, because I think this is especially important. As of January 15th, 2020, so a little over a year ago, the FDA has determined specifically that its irradiation regulations with regard to over-the-counter drugs and labeling of over-the-counter drugs sterilized using ionizing radiation is out of date and unnecessary. That is their specific words. They concluded and therefore determined that drugs sterilized using ionizing radiation need not be labeled. So the FDA has specifically rescinded its labeling requirement for drugs that are sterilized using ionizing radiation. That is the most analogous situation you're going to find in the federal regulations, not food regulations. But how does the FDA treat drugs? It doesn't require labeling because it recognizes this works, it's safe. We don't need to be requiring labeling. The other thing that I want to make sure everybody understands is even when there's labeling on food, and again, I'm not talking about food, even when there's labeling on food treated with ionizing radiation, the only labeling that is required, as Dr. Tung accurately points out in his public comment, is food that is treated with a certain amount of radiation, threshold amount of radiation, and it's only on final packaging. So a good example of that would be if you were to irradiate a spice or an herb such as oregano to sterilize it, and then that irradiated product went into a later product, for example, a pasta sauce. The packaging of the pasta sauce, the jar that you buy the pasta sauce in, or the container that you buy it in, doesn't have to have any labeling. And the oregano that had been irradiated to then go to the pasta sauce manufacturer, it wouldn't also require any labeling either. So in the case of drugs specifically, labeling is not required. The third main point that's covered in the written materials and these slides is with respect to Regulation 12.065 itself and how it came to be adopted. And I don't want to belabor the point with regard to the litigation that ultimately led us here, but I would direct you to slide 37, which I think is a good overview of the timeline for the adoption of the regulation. And I don't believe that it is coincidental that within a week and a half of RadSource obtaining a writ lifting the ban on its machines, this proposed regulation then comes into play. And my colleague, co-counsel Ms. Max Rushton, can easily talk about the numerous procedural and legal issues with how this regulation came to be adopted. But the general point, and this is covered in a number of the slides, is it wasn't properly adopted in relation to the timeline, and there are a number of issues with it. So that brings us to the fourth point, and I think that was the fourth point has been addressed in RadSource's materials. It was addressed in the public comments that were read this morning, and in particular Dr. Tung's comments, but a number of the other industry members' comments. This specific regulation let's see if I can't bring it up. This specific regulation, I don't believe accomplishes what I think is the CCB's actual goal here. And I think that this is a goal that both the CCB and, quite frankly, RadSource have in common. I think that the CCB's goal here and RadSource's goal is to make sure that when consumers are buying the ultimate end product, they can feel comfortable with the information that's provided in the packaging of that product and knowing that they are buying a product that is then as safe as it could be for them to use. Now, I don't know that there's anything that RadSource or any cultivator or any dispensary can do about the fact that there are certain inherent dangers in a product that you will smoke, but that is nothing that any remediation or treatment is going to be able to get around. So what is RadSource doing? RadSource is actually making sure that the product that is being purchased by consumers doesn't have contaminants, making it more dangerous to them. If you put a label on a package of a product that was treated using a RadSource machine, and only those products that were treated with RadSource and not any other decontamination process, what you are telling the consumer, especially when you have a brief notice that says this product contains ingredients that have been treated with irradiation and nothing more, you are telling the consumer there may be something wrong with this product. We're not going to tell you what, and there's nowhere for you to go to find out what this actually means. We're just telling you, you should be on notice. I mean, originally it said warning. I don't think changing it to notice makes that much of a difference, but you're telling them there's potentially a problem with this, when in fact, there's nothing wrong with it. It is safe. This is a deterrent. And I think if you want more evidence that this is in fact a deterrent, look at the public comments that were submitted by Zeal and Willow, who are RadSource's competitors. They are strongly against themselves being regulated in any way, but they're fully in favor of there being a labeling requirement that applies to their main competitor, because they fully appreciate that this is a deterrent that gives them a business advantage. So you're not actually providing any useful information. You're not like the FDA in that you have any information available on a website or publications of any kind that actually explains the benefits of ionizing radiation. There is no information about alternative treatment forms that are designed to decontaminate. There's nothing submitted in the public comments by the competitors that says that RadSource doesn't work or that RadSource isn't safe. They just love the idea of only their competitor having to have a label on its product. So what you've done is you've alarmed consumers without providing them backup information. And you've suggested there's something wrong with the product when in fact the opposite is true. It has been decontaminated. It has been decontaminated to a contaminant level too few to count. And yet there's a label that suggests to them that they should be scared of this product. that's counterproductive. So at the end of the day, I think the only option, given how the regulation came about and the problems with that, combined with the fact that it doesn't accomplish what I believe is the CCB's ultimate goal, it needs to be repealed. At this point, Dr. Young or the other board members, if you have questions for me, I'd be happy to address them or refer you to some of the people we have on the line with us that are far more knowledgeable in the specifics of the technology.
Well, thank you. Thank you for the comment and the presentation and being the succinctness. I do appreciate all the materials that you provided regarding the studies and the information specific to rad source in regards to decontamination of food products and its approval. I do have some questions. I think I'll open it up to the other board members or anyone who might have some questions. And I did actually want to also listen to Ms. Cronkite and have, before we get into this, but maybe we should even start there. I've asked Ms. Cronkite to speak regarding her position at the CCB, the testing, the decontamination requirements, what exactly is tested. Kara, are you on the line?
Yes, I'm here.
Hi. I was wondering if you might be able to comment, in your role, what is required in terms of the testing, what are we testing for, and the amount of decontamination that we see, but also with the majority or the other cultivators in terms of what they're doing for decontamination, if that's even required.
Absolutely. Good morning, Chairman and members of the board. For the record, my name is Kara Cronkite. I'm the Health Program Manager 2 of the CCB. I oversee the inspectors and auditors. Just a little background on cannabis testing. The licensed cultivation establishments grow the cannabis plants. Once a specific strain is harvested, it's referred to as a batch. Within each batch, the cannabis is separated out into lots for testing and sales purposes. A lot of flower is limited to 5 pounds and a lot of trim is limited to 15 pounds. Each lot is tested by an independent testing laboratory. The laboratory is responsible for collecting the samples at the cultivation facility. The laboratory representative is the one that selects the sample from each lot directly. Samples are not provided to them by the cultivator pre-selected. Usable cannabis is tested immediately prior to packaging, and it's tested for moisture, potency, terpenes, foreign matter, mycotoxins, heavy metals, pesticides, yeast and mold, Enterobacteriaceae, Salmonella, E. coli, 4 specific species of Aspergillus, and coliforms. Once the lab has completed the testing, they provide a certificate of analysis, which is a report that shows the values for each category. On average, only about 15% of usable cannabis grown at cultivation does not pass. So this shows that about 85% of the cannabis grown in Nevada is grown with sanitary practices and is able to meet our testing requirements without remediation. The most common reason for failure is microbial contamination. And the most common cause in that category specifically is yeast and mold. If the cannabis does fail, the cultivator is typically able to send that lot to a production facility for extraction as a form of remediation. So it's very rare that product is actually destroyed. The labels for cannabis and cannabis products include a lot of information for the consumer, such as the method of extraction, ingredients, allergens, and as well as several notices and warnings. I'm available to answer any additional questions that you may have. Thank you.
So my understanding from what you were discussing, 85% of the tested lots pass with no signs of contamination?
Correct.
And that's specific for the microbials that you were talking about, Aspergillus and the coliforms?
Yes, that would include any reason for failure, including pesticides or heavy metals.
Okay, so a number of things. Okay, perfect. Do you know what number of cultivators are using post-harvest decontamination of any sort?
I don't know the exact number off the top of my head, but I would estimate it's around 10.
So 90% of the cultivators now use no form of post-harvest decontamination, and the majority of that passes the testing.
Correct.
Okay. again, just trying to identify how significant of a problem that we're talking about. Okay, I appreciate that. And thank you for your time today. I really appreciate it. Mr. Schwartz, are you still on the line?
I am, Dr. Young. If I could address a couple of points Ms. Cronkite made, and I appreciate
Please do.
the presentation from her as well. First, I want to point out and make sure that we're all talking apples to apples here. The passing doesn't mean that there's not contaminants or detectable contaminants. The passing means that the contaminants are below, and I believe the number is 10,000 CFUs, which are colony forming units. Colony forming units would be if you were to take a microbial swab and grow it out in a lab on petri dishes on different things, what would ultimately grow into a contaminant. And so if you pass, that means that you're just below 10,000 CFUs. It could be 7,000, it could be too few to detect. RadSource, and I won't speak as to its competitors because I don't know their numbers, but RadSource prides itself on being able to not just pass a product, but to get that product to too few to detect, so that it significantly decreases the likelihood of there ever being something growing at a later date. The other point to be made is that the testing is done pretty much immediately post-harvest, which is, quite frankly, when it's going to be at its cleanest that it can be. And even at that point, you still have approximately 15% failing. I think I touched on this earlier, but I just want to make sure that I'm clear. There isn't a subsequent test that is done, and there's nothing in the regulations that talk about any kind of limitation on shelf life. So you can have a test that's done almost immediately post-harvest, and you could have 7,000 CFUs at that time, meaning it passes, but you do have some contaminants. Within weeks, when there's no subsequent testing, that product could be infested with mold, or it could be contaminated in other means with other pathogens. And there's nothing that's being done right now to test it at that later date. I mean, quite frankly, what you have is an industry that is at that point on the honor system.
Can I interrupt you there for a sec?
Sure.
So I mean, so from what you're saying, I feel like you're implying that the RadSource sterilizes, completely eradicates, and I don't think that's true. Is that?
No.
So if you left a product even from RadSource, if it sat on the shelf long enough, it could also potentially grow out, aspergillus or mold or any other contaminant down the road, right?
That is correct. I would say that it is far less likely than something that hasn't been treated at all. And it doesn't rule out the possibility either of another subsequent round of decontamination.
Right. And for Ms. Cronkite's comments, it was more, I think, of an issue of trying to just see what the level of safety is. So I certainly hear what you're saying in terms of using RadSource or a post-harvest decontamination method reduces it, and so we're saying safe versus safer. But in terms of the guideline of what is considered safe, Ms. Cronkite is saying that 85% of the products that are tested are safe. But if you're right, but meaning that their colony count is below the threshold of what is considered safe.
Correct.
Okay.
Correct.
And I don't mean to interrupt you. I'm sorry. I'll let you finish with your.
I appreciate the discussion. The other point is, I think that the number of cultivators who are using decontamination technologies, be it RadSource or radio frequency from Zeal or ozone from Willow or from some of the other market participants, non-licensee vendors, is meaningfully higher than the 10% number. But that's just based upon my understanding of the number of customers that RadSource alone has, as well as what it understands to be the market participation of Zealand Willow. So I think it's probably higher. Probably one of the RadSource gentlemen that is on the call might be able to give you a better number if we're really interested, but I think it is significantly higher.
Okay. To skip now to, kind of talking about your presentation, and I had some questions regarding some of the information that you provided. And this could be for yourself or certainly anybody at RadSource who feels that they would be better at answering the question. The first I want to talk about is specifically the paper, in Exhibit 7 regarding, using irradiation to decontaminate cannabis, in the flower. I just, that study was actually done with gamma radiation, and you guys specifically use X-ray. So it is a different source of radiation, correct? I mean, so you're not actually saying, with a RadSource technology, this paper was published. You're just saying in general, using irradiation, although it be it from a different source, has been shown to be effective.
That is correct. And if we want to get into the very specifics of the difference in the, obviously gamma radiation comes from a different source. It is still ionizing radiation nonetheless. If we wanted to get into the real details of that, I would actually refer probably to Dr. Chernowski, who's also on this call, if you have specific questions about that. But the proposition that I think the point you were making is that was done using a gamma source, so ionizing radiation, but not specifically a RadSource machine, and that is correct.
Okay. Is there information specific to RadSource in reducing decontamination for cannabis products, specific for the RadSource? Because that was going to lead to my. Let me answer that, and then I'll ask my second question.
Yes, and I think probably, unless he tells me otherwise, George Terry, who's on with us, would be the best person to answer that specific question because he's familiar with RadSource and its use not just in Nevada, but in the cannabis industry generally and a lot of the other regulated markets as well. So I would actually defer to Mr. Terry for the data that he has on that information.
Okay. Is there anything he wants to present if he's present, or?
I know for certain he is on, and I don't know if he can be enabled to also.
Okay, well, and if he's just looking at that was going to lead to my second question, and that you comment back on the study that was done in Nevada regarding Flower One. Now that specifically looked at the effects of RadSource on THC and terpenes, and I guess ultimately adulterating the cannabis product, and it found that it didn't change it significantly. And I think it was a good study. I mean, I think it definitely. But you never actually looked at decontaminating as an end result of that study, right? That was never looked at. It was just really just looking at the THC and the terpene changes.
I see that my RadSource executive team, so this is Dr. Justin Chernowski and George Terry. So I'll let them actually address.
Okay, please. Oh yeah,
your
please.
Question and
the prior
question as well.
Hi, Dr. Young and everybody. Thank you for allowing us to present. Around testing, we have hundreds, if not thousands, of tests that show the decontamination of the flower post harvest once it runs through the irradiator. Now, Dr. Chernowski is going to just talk to you about the difference between the gamma and X-ray. And the only real paper that we have that exists on X-ray decontamination, at least for cannabis, is the Flower One study that Joel showed earlier. But we also have some chromatographs that we had G3 Labs run as well, and he'll talk about that as well. There's the difference between gamma and X-ray is the wavelength. We're at a larger wavelength than the gamma. So, and RF is at a very high wavelength. It has to do with the penetration, but it's also the power. So the power that we provide as an X-ray provider with the photons is about 3% of what the big gamma radiators do. So with that, I'll turn it over to Dr. Chanowski.
Yeah, so we're arguably talking about the electromagnetic spectrum in general. And so we're just on the ionizing radiation part. I think we've all established that. The gamma study is ionizing radiation. George is correct about the wavelength. The difference is the method of photon production. You have a radioactive isotope with a gamma source, whereas with ours, we're basically a high power light bulb that you can control and turn on and off. You cannot do that with an isotope source. It's actually the principal reason our company was founded and why we've done so well in the blood industry is because oftentimes these gamma radiators are being replaced with much safer X-ray options and having the same remediation effects, even in the blood industry, and we are even seeing it in the cannabis industry with all the studies that we've submitted.
UV as well. UV is right below X-ray.
UVC is considered ionizing.
Yes, it's considered ionizing. So even sunlight, there's other things that have ionizing radiation. And, I think there's a lot of people that we have that are customers, and we know of a lot of people in Nevada that are using not only our technology, but our competitors' technology. So that might be one of the reasons why the testing results are as low as what was stated before, is because there are a lot of people that are going through remediation early.
Right. Now, in specific to the Flower One study, did you actually look at decontamination in regards of decreasing microbials? I didn't see that anywhere in the study.
I think that test, the only requirement for that test was the THC and
Do we know what delivered doses we gave it?
Yeah, they're doing the study.
Yeah, so we consider a rough decontamination dose about 2,000 gray. It's just roughly. So as long as those studies have been done to those numbers, then we would consider that is delivering a decontaminating dose and also not affecting the flower. I think that is what the point of the study ended up showing. It might not have been as clear as it needed to be, but yes, we delivered a decontaminating dose and proved that it does not produce any radiolytic species. We also proved that it doesn't change the actual profile of the cannabis plant as well.
Right, and not to belittle the study that you mentioned in regards to the gamma radiation. I was just more of a point that, even in the statements that you say that, really X-ray would be preferable to gamma radiation because of the potential of contamination from gamma because of the need to be with the isotope.
Yeah,
and I certainly understand that.
Yeah,
yeah. At one point, I had to work with iodine 131, so I understand. But I just found it interesting that you say the X-ray is superior to the gamma, but the study that you provide uses gamma radiation. It doesn't use yeah.
Well, no, the Flower One study was an X-ray study, but the other study, you're correct, is a gamma because those studies were done at a time where X-ray wasn't a viable option. It wasn't available. This is a new technology. We started with blood with graft versus host disease. So we actually took our technology from the blood. We've got 38 units, 39 now at the American Red Cross that are irradiating blood. And also we've got, we've sold units to many of the pharmaceuticals that are now creating vaccines for viral inactivation. So it's the same technology that we're using for viral inactivation, for sterile insect technique, and for blood. And we've adapted it to cannabis, and with the X-ray with the lower power, it's more of an absorbed dose. So it's more effective at a lower power into the target subject than blasting it with the gamma at a higher MEV. We're at MEV, we're not even at MEV. We're not even on that scale.
Okay, great. That answers, it was just more points and just kind of curiosity in regards to the studies. Okay, great. Mr. Swartz, I had some other questions. Your point number 2 in regards to cannabis really not being food. I mean, it isn't a large part of, there's the edibles, there are aspects of it that are ingested. I mean, is it reasonable to think that, it's a food-like product or?
And I understand your question, Doctor, and I would answer that in 3 parts, I think. Number 1, we've provided in the written materials and with an overview in the PowerPoint, a lot of the information that shows that rad source machines specifically are used at the USDA, for example, have been used in research on shellfish and other food products to be an effective decontamination method in food. Number two is when we're focusing specifically on labeling requirements, as it pertains to food only pertain to the end final product if that is if that is a product that is treated with ionizing radiation. The other thing I would like to point out now, since we're having the discussion, is we're talking specifically today about the labeling regulation. The CCB does not have any other regulations that were carried over from food. And there are other regulations that apply to decontamination of food that don't just apply to ionizing radiation, but also there are sections of the CFR that apply to the federal regulations that apply to all decontamination treatments of food. So anybody who's producing a device or a process that is used in the processing of food has a whole host of regulations within the FDA that apply to them. The only regulation that has been carried over by the CCB as of right now is labeling of products that have been treated with ionizing radiation. And again, it's been in the public comments, it's in the written materials we submitted. The current version of regulation 12.065 doesn't really define radiation. It doesn't really define what specific processes it's talking about. If it actually is intended to only apply to ionizing radiation, it doesn't say that. But if that's the intent of it, then what you have is a regulation that is really only intended to apply to one market participant.
Okay. I had some questions specifically about labeling. Now, in the information that you presented initially, I think it was exhibit 8 through exhibit 13. And those were all specific sources regarding using rad source technology to decontaminate food products. And I do appreciate all that information you provided. Do you know, do those products require special labeling or the Radura symbol on those products?
I'm going to defer that to
yes. If someone, absolutely.
But I think the answer is if it's not an end product, the answer is no. But George raising his hand, so I know he's much.
So I actually worked with the FDA when all these requirements came out under the MED, and went through different departments in the FDA trying to get somebody to make a ruling on cannabis, and they wouldn't touch it because according to the FDA, cannabis is a controlled substance and it's not under their purview, right? However, they said that if it's a food additive, so to your question about, what cannabis is added to food, but also oregano is added to spaghetti sauce. So if oregano is irradiated and it's added to spaghetti sauce, the final packaging does not require any kind of labeling. So if cannabis is irradiated and it's added to a brownie or a cookie or a gummy, if you're following the same guidelines as food, which we shouldn't be because it's not a food, it would not require labeling. Now let's switch it over to what Joel was saying earlier. If it's a drug, so if I've got aspirin or any over-the-counter drug or even some prescription drugs that are irradiated, they don't require federal regulation. They don't require labeling or Raduras or anything like that as well. So if I add aspirin to a brownie, or if I add a Tylenol to a brownie, then, of course, I want to be ethical and say I've got a Tylenol brownie, because it's a drug. But that's what you have when you have a marijuana cookie. It's inherent. It's implied in the name. but there is no requirement for a Redura. So if on the drug side, we don't have to label because of the radiation, or it's just photons at different wavelengths. So if we don't have to label on the drug side, and we add it to a food, and we're going to follow food regulations, then we should not have to do it on the cannabis side either.
Now, but specifically to my question in regards to the documents that were provided regarding your treatment of shellfish, lemons, and peaches. I mean, do those products, does the FDA require the Redura symbol on those products that they're that are using rad source technology?
There is hold on. Nathan, do you want to take that one?
I don't know if Nathan can. Nathan and Jeff, I think it would be.
There are some labeling requirements from the FDA on irradiated foods, but I think it's meat, fish, and poultry, I believe. There's not that many that require.
And produce. I think it's meat, fish. Yeah, I think you're right. I think it's all those plus produce.
Yeah, because even like we know, I live in Florida actually, and the strawberries are irradiated. However, I can't find the irradiation sticker on anything, even though I know that they go through the irradiation process. However, on dog treats, you will find the Redura on there because dog treats and stuff like that are required to be irradiated.
Okay.
But I've got an expert.
And that was going to lead to a follow-up question. Let me just because we talk about over-the-counter aspirin, you mentioned specifically. Are there any examples of over-the-counter drugs that are treated with the rad source technology that do not require the Redura labeling or some type of specific labeling? I understand the FDA has come down with that with their ruling and from February of 2020. I was just wondering, is there specific examples of where that technology is used that we know for sure that there's no labeling required?
So the technology is ionizing radiation. So typically those types of over-the-counter drugs are go through gamma radiation. So they're at a higher MEV. Remember, we're a new technology in X-ray. Up to 5 years ago, imaging X-ray was used in order to do irradiation. Now we have a patented technology that gives out a different pattern of photons that delivers a better dose, an absorbed dose, which I know you're familiar with. So the absorbed dose of our product is different than you would get from an imaging tube. Okay, so to your question is, we have some studies that are being done with the USDA. There's 3 units with the USDA. They use it for phytosanitary, but we have not been in the drug area, over-the-counter drug area, because that's gamma. However, on the viral inactivation and some of the other platforms, we've been there. Why haven't we been on the drug side? It's just lack of opportunity, number one. We are ionizing radiation, but the doses are a lot higher because before you brought up the word sterile, the FDA has got very stringent requirements around what you can label sterile. So we never use the word sterile because we understand it might require 10,000 gray. Well, we don't need 10,000 gray to get to 2 few to detect. We only need 2,000 in most cases, and we have some customers that are 12,000 gray. We have some customers that are 3,200 gray. Every customer understands that for their product and for their strain, to get it down to 2 few to detect will significantly elongate the period that remaining coliform or aspergillus will have the ability to grow back to a dangerous level before it hits a consumer.
Right.
Yeah, I mean, George kind of covered my points. Dr. Young, what you're basically trying to ask is, what industry studies have we done? We are working with bodies to do some of those studies, but as George points out, a lot of those studies that you've received have been done with ionizing radiation on the gamma level, which are more of a one-size-fits-all type thing and not specific to rad source. However, the fundamentals of the technology remain consistent between our machines and the gammas in the sense that the actions taken in order to promote the decontamination process are the same fundamental mechanisms on kind of a Maxwell's demon level. So in kind of what George is saying, we see a better absorption with our X-ray machines. So some of these studies are going to have to be redone using X-ray, especially these lower energy X-rays, because the absorbed dose, the cross-sectional absorbed dose is much higher than what you're getting with these much smaller gamma wavelengths, which statistically will pass through an object more so than interact with an object. I don't know if that answers your question. I think it's kind of going around. It's not necessarily going around it, but it's kind of in the vein of what you're asking.
No, it actually, I think it does. I think you do answer the question, and I appreciate you clarifying that. Part of it is, in terms of the technologies that have been available, obviously you're a newer technology, so some of the things just haven't occurred yet because honestly, you just haven't been in the game that long.
Correct.
So that really does answer my question. And so you have to use the closest resource available to explain, and I understand, and the energy level is different, and I get that, but there's more than enough energy that's being provided to decontaminate, and I understand and not sterilize. I was just making that point only in regards to Mr. Swartz's comment that I thought he was implying that it was more that direction. I said, well, that's not true. You're reducing the colony count, but you are not eliminating the colony.
Correct. Well, that's why we call it too few to detect, because
exactly. Yeah, okay.
It's just under the threshold of the detection limit of the machine. That doesn't necessarily mean there's zero there, and we don't claim that there's nothing there.
Well, it's actually not even the machine. It's the testing.
It's the testing
level.
Correct.
So the testing level, if it's too few to detect, they're not really seeing any, but they can't say for sure there's zero. So the testing labs will use something called too few to detect, where they're not seeing any colorful CFU, but they can't say zero because they know they think it's not sterile. That's one of the things.
It's under the threshold of their detection machine.
And back to the labeling, is there any specifics in regards to rad source that any examples you can give of products that are using that X-ray technology, either through rad source or a competitor, that do not require some sort of special labeling from
blood insects?
I was just going to point out, I've been with RadSource for 10 plus years. And I wanted to point, you asked earlier if any of our customers are putting the Radura label on any of their products. And the answer is no. We do not have one customer who's using our equipment. We have equipment that's being used worldwide that are using the Radura symbol. They're not required to.
But specifically for things that are ingested. So I'm not talking about, blood. I'm talking about, food or food-like products. Is there anything specific to RadSource where they're not requiring the label?
According to the federal guidelines, they would be, if it was on a final package, like say they packaged it in the final position and then they irradiate it, they would be required to. We do not have any customers that are doing that. But as we pointed out repeatedly, and I'll just repeat it one more time, if it's done during the processing and not the final package, then it's not required to have the Radura.
Okay, that helps. I do appreciate that. And I appreciate the executive team and being here and answering all the questions. I don't want to get too lost in the trees. I just had some questions regarding some of the things that you guys had presented. On the third point, Mr. Swartz, that you had presented in terms of the creating of the 12.065. Mr. Klimas, Tyler, do you have any comments on that regarding what brought that regulation specifically? Is Tyler around?
Thanks, Member Young. Yes, this is Director Klimas. For the record, that was part just of the regulation drafting process for the NCCRs. Kara, if you want to add to that you certainly can. But as far as I understand it, that was our process as we were developing the NCCRs. We got to that point. 12.065 was added. We did receive comment from Ms. Rushton at the time, which I do believe, Ms. Rushton, you even indicated that changing warning to notice would be acceptable. And I think that's why we made that change at the meeting. But Kara, if you want to add to that, I do believe that it was just in the normal course of us promulgating the NCCRs. Member Young.
Great, thank you. There's some question about, the labeling. I think we're all in agreement that, the safety to the consumer is paramount. But my understanding the labeling in no way says that it's by being irradiated that the product is not safe. I mean, is that true? And that's kind of more of an open comment to anybody.
I think we would say that we've had numerous, exhibits submitted that show the opposite, that there's a lack of consumer education on the subject. And so they would see the label and not know how to interpret the label,
Right.
and thus misconstrue the label as being unsafe.
The FDA has been fighting this battle for years, and we still have people that think that if something's treated with a radiation, that it's radioactive. And it's just something, it's a stigma in the whole society. So drugs, any kind of drugs, blood, anything that's treated with a radiation, which are just photons, whether it's RF or sunlight or UV grow lights or X-rays or gamma, people perceive it as negative. And one of the dispensary owners out in Nevada actually told me that it's because people get associated with chemo, with cancer, with radiation treatment and stuff like that. That's one of the things, but there's probably a plethora of different.
And Director Klimas, I guess this would be directed more towards you specifically or anybody from the CCB. Has there been any comment from the consumers specifically wanting to know that there's been some sort of post-harvest treatment, including with irradiation? Does the consumer want to know?
Well, this workshop process, as you know, we did an informal public solicitation before the formal public workshop notice, and we did receive comment. I believe there were 5 total comments, but there were at least a couple comments in there from the consumer side. They're posted online. They're always posted online during our informal solicitation periods. But there were a couple comments from the public on the interest of understanding and having this labeling on there. And just to add real quick, Member Young, to your question on the regulation process, at the end of the day, and just generally speaking, and I think RadSource even agreed with us, right? Our job as the CCB and the CCB staff is to protect the public health and safety of Nevadans. It's in the public policy. It's a large reason of why we're here. So the approach on 12065 was to know that there were some things that we don't know. And so our approach was, let's protect the public health and safety. So if there are some unknowns, we're always going to err on that side of things. But I'm glad we're sitting here talking about this today. Hopefully that's helpful and answers your question.
Probably don't. This is Chair Douglas, Commissioner Young. Couple of things. One is that it is clear from the court proceedings as well as our review at this point that 12065 can't stand as presently written. The question today is whether or not it is amended or just totally repealed. And I would ask Member Durrett to comment because she was at a vaping conference just recently. And I just saw the squibs in the paper, but one of the things that caught my eye in the newspaper was that the people at that conference were concerned as to public safety and being made aware of things. So the question for us is, as we address public safety, is how do we make the public aware, not singling out any entity that has a safe product. RadSource, from everything that's been presented, has a safe product. The question, though, is that how do we make the public aware? They were looking at products, the tobacco and vaping, but clearly leafy substance and vaping goes to cannabis additionally. So the public, at least in the comment I saw in the paper, which is sometimes true, sometimes untrue, wants to be made aware of concerns. So the real question for us is, do we make them aware? And if we do, how do we do it? And I don't know if Ms. Tourette has any comments because she was at this public workshop that we didn't sponsor, but she was a participant in.
Thanks so much, Chairman and members. I would comment, I think I know the reference you're talking about in the newspaper. There was kind of this overall summary of the summit saying it's clear that there needs to be more warnings and notifications on packaging and labeling. And I do not think that is clear. I think we have a lot of warnings and notifications on our packaging and labeling. What we need to do is streamline them so that we're focusing on the most important warnings, so certain warnings aren't getting lost. I think that I think there's an intention of doing that going forward. But I'm wondering, as it relates back to this, if we were to err on the side of caution and at least give consumers, even if x-rays aren't dangerous for them to consume, maybe they want to know. And so is there a way we could change the language to give them some informed consent of what they're consuming without singling out irradiation, without singling out rad source, something like this was treated with this has been treated with some post decontamination process, post-harvest decontamination process, just something that's general. Although I am sensitive to not wanting to just pile on to the warnings and notifications and wanting to streamline them, but I also do completely understand the consumer's desire to know what's going on.
Commissioner Young, I see my executive team from RadSource has got their hand raised. I think I know pretty close to what it is they're going to say, but I'm going to allow them to say it because in many cases they're far more articulate than I am.
Well, yeah, we agree. I mean, we agree that so we think that obviously labeling with this product has been remediated might give off the wrong impression. I think what we might suggest is actually just putting the CFU count at testing and testing date on there, because that's actually the hazard to the product, the hazard to the consumer. The hazard is what is growing there that is unsafe. So if you put on the label that it was treated, that's actually a positive thing, but it might be misconstrued inappropriately. We think if the CFU levels are on there instead, which is what we were going to suggest as our option, that might give the consumers a better idea of what they are consuming. That's more meaningful in terms of what they're actually putting in their body.
Right. If the THC level and those other, the potency on there, if you want to be, I mean, if you put this has been treated with post-harvest decontamination, we know as a consumer, I actually had my girlfriend was using cannabis when she was a cancer patient, and we went to the dispensary and it had the potency and everything, but it didn't tell me the CFU. So I had no idea what the aspergillus was in there or the CFU. But I did know that if it passed state testing, it was at a safe level. So,
but that doesn't necessarily mean it's not growing back.
That's not going to grow
and
back.
That was kind of the point I think that Joel was making at one is it is a threshold, and if it's just under that threshold, that might be something that consumers might want to consider as opposed to something that's more safe.
In other states like Colorado, they have secret shoppers, and Michigan as well. What they find is they'll go in and something will pass testing at 5,000, 7,000 CFU because some of the other competitive technologies can't get it down to too few to detect. So it's going to be it's going to be below the state testing threshold, or people that are growing organically and they like Joel said, at that time when they package and they test, it's the cleanest probably that it will be because of the nature of the growth. But then it goes on the shelf or it goes through packaging and it doesn't appear into a dispensary maybe 3 or 10 weeks later or whatever. It's not going to be the same CFU level or aspergillus level. So, the idea of putting that test date on there or even having a secret shopper program like they have in Colorado and in Michigan, those secret shopper programs are finding that when they go back into the dispensary, something that originally tested at 8,000 or 5,000 or 2,000 CFU, 6 weeks later are testing at 80,000 or higher. We actually have an internal study that was done by an independent lab that shows some of those results as well. the growth.
Dr. Young, just one brief follow-up comment to this, and there are other people on this call, I believe, from your side of things, as well as my co-counsel who know the regulations inside and outside. But I believe that the 12.030, 12.035, and 12.040 actually in the regulations have samples of what would be considered an appropriate label. And there is, as Board Member Durrett has pointed out, a fair amount of information in there. And what's already on there is the testing date. And there already is, as George pointed out, information about the THC and other components as tested. And so adding the CFU count, I think Brad's Horse obviously is in favor of that, would be informative. And I think that there's been some comments that were being made about, there are a number of decontamination techniques that are used. And I don't know that there's any public available information about them. I don't know that you can put all of that into a label, and I don't think it makes any sense. I think that's just going to cause more consumer confusion. But the information about any of the remediation techniques is just not something that is generally publicly available at this time.
So it sounds like, I mean, we're all somewhat in agreement that keeping the safety of the public, of course, is paramount, and that it doesn't sound like anybody's against necessary labeling of the product. They would just like it to be more open, so for all potential, I guess, sources of post-harvest decontamination. I guess the difficulty with me with putting the CFU, the colony forming units, is that's a very scientific term. I mean, that would be like putting the amount of radiation that is used. That would be very confusing, I think, for most consumers. And Member Durrett, I really appreciate your comments, because it sounds, I agree. It sounds like the public wants to be informed. I mean, they want to know how their product is treated. And I think that's not an unreasonable request.
Dr. Young?
Doctor?
This is
Yeah.
Kimberly Rushton. One comment I would make is that you may want to consider repealing 12.065 and then further amending one of the existing labeling statutes, whereby you would add the CFU requirement, and then thereafter you could define what that means. And that's what, again, the regulations should be for, not just the industry members, but for interested parties who want information and that is specific to the practice of the CCB and its industry members. So what I would recommend for consideration, and happy to prepare a draft for review by the CCB, is to repeal 12.065, amend the other labeling requirements to add the CFU, and then defining what that means so that the consumers in the industry are aware.
Well, I would certainly take that into consideration, and I appreciate that.
Doctor?
Yes.
Just one comment on what we just discussed as well. So I just want to be really careful about, and it's your state, and I realize you guys are the experts in that area. I just see it in a lot of different areas, a lot of different states, and a lot of different regulatory bodies. But just, people care about, if they care about what kind of decontamination technique is used on their cannabis, if they even knew about it, then why wouldn't they care what kind of nutrients are put into the soil? Why wouldn't they care about what kind of soil is used? Why wouldn't they care about what kind of trimming machines used? What kind of grow lights are used? So I think to single out something that is, of course, I've got a vested interest, but to single out something that's one part of the whole process is kind of, an area that we should look at. And the other part of that is every decontamination technique has got its own different merits, right? So the people that use ozone, it's actually oxidizing the flower. The people that are using RF are actually heating it. we're using x-rays, so we're actually doing ionizing radiation. So what's to say, as a consumer, which one's better or which one's more effective by just having the CFU level being at a passing level? Why would a consumer be concerned with which
What technique?
why just the post decontamination process is labeled and not any of the other part of the grow process?
Member Young, this is Kara Cronkite for the record, if I may speak.
Please.
I just wanted to point out that the lab reports, which do show the CFU program for every microbial, they are available to consumers at the dispensary upon request, as well as the soil amendment reports. So the consumers do have that information accessible to them, such as what soil was used as for growing the cannabis plants. We also disclose on the label the method of extraction. So if they used CO2, it would say this product was extracted using CO2. This doesn't mean CO2 extraction is dangerous. It's just informational for the purpose of transparency. So I just wanted to point out that information is currently available to the consumers.
Ms. Cronkite, is that information available to the public, or is it just available?
Yes, anyone could ask the dispensary for specific lab reports. We also post a lot of our information on the website as well.
Okay, thank you. Any other comments from members or? And I agree with Chairman that it sounds as though our current regulation is going to have to be amended or discarded. I think I've received plenty of information. I'm certainly not ready to make a decision today, but I think I think I could certainly make some comments before our next board meeting. Does anyone have anything else they would like to add?
Dr. Hyde, and to the other board members also, and to Kara and everyone else that participated, I just want to say on behalf of RadSource and myself, we greatly appreciate the time and effort that has clearly gone into the preparation for this workshop on everyone's end, and based upon the questions that were posed today and the discussion that was had, it's clear that everyone was well informed, and so we greatly appreciate the time. We can see that there was effort, and thank you for the opportunity to present today.
Thank you.
From our perspective, Dr. Young and the rest of the members of the board, we are willing to provide any information you need, testing results from other states. We're working with other states closely. We are here for public safety, whether it's in blood, whether it's in sterile insect technique, whether it's in viral inactivation, or any of the other verticals that we work in. We're all about public safety, whether it's eliminating radioactive isotopes, and we're working closely with the government, cesium replacement programs to make the world a better and safer place, but also too within each of the verticals with the industry and even in the cannabis. So we thank you very much for your time and your interest. We're happy it got to this point where we were actually able to present, to the board our information and leave it open for questions for you guys to come back. Dr. Chanowski is a surface chemist. He's got his PhD. We have plenty of PhDs on staff, physicists, and we have other consultants that are PhDs in microbiology. And we even have a NASA scientist, Dr. Roger Kern, that wrote the paper. He's actually a NASA scientist. He was in charge of the microbials going on in the, making sure that the U.S. didn't pollute the surface of Mars with microbials. And they use irradiation in order to disinfect it. So thank you very much.
Great, thank you. And thank everyone from the CCB and the members, as well as the executive committee. Mr. Swartz, thank you everybody for being here today. Director Klimas, can I turn this over to you now to, I guess, finish the workshop? Is there anything additional?
Thank you, Member Young. We have a phone ringing, so bear with us for 30 more seconds here. I'm afraid to answer and disconnect us, but just give us 1 second. Great, thank you. All right. So we'll now go to public comment. We do have some public comment that came in during the workshop. I do want to say as well, and I just had a chance to mention it, but as we've done with all our workshops, we do have informal comment periods where we do solicit comments. And when we take those or we receive those comments, per the directions, we post those online. So as we mentioned and was discussed by a few different parties, there was some more public comment. It is online under our public meetings page and available for anybody to look at. That being said, Tiana or Ms. Bonner, I believe you've got at least one public comment to read on the record, so please proceed.
Okay, yes, we have 3 public comments that we've received. I will start with this one from John Sand. Thank you for the opportunity to submit comments related to the Cannabis Compliance Board's discussion on potential changes or amendments to NCCR 12.065 during the CCB's noticed meeting on January 21st, 2021. Providing these comments on behalf of our client, New Leaf. We're thrilled and excited that the CCB will be reviewing changes to NCCR 12.065, and we are hopeful that we can be included in any future discussion on any revisions to this particular regulation. For reasons more thoroughly discussed below, we feel strongly that NCCR 12.065 should be amended to remove notice requirements that cannabis has been treated with radiation when the only radiation the cannabis product has been exposed to is non-ionizing radiation. This is consistent with established guidance from the Food and Drug Administration, which only requires notice and the use of the Rajura symbol when items have been exposed to ionizing radiation. Non-ionizing radiation is safe and individuals are commonly exposed to this radiation throughout the day from all types of electronic devices, such as Wi-Fi routers, cell phone signals, microwaves, etc. In fact, the machines that New Leaf uses to treat some of its cannabis products expose the cannabis to non-ionizing radiation that is much less than the household microwave. Because exposure to non-ionizing radiation is safe, we believe the current notice requirement contained in NCCR 12.065 is misleading to consumers and does a disservice to the industry. In effect, it would be like requiring restaurants to provide notice to their customers that their food has been exposed to radiation if the restaurant heated the food in a microwave. In reality, there is little, if any, difference between the RF machines used by New Leaf to treat cannabis from the microwaves used by restaurants. And for this reason, New Leaf strongly supports an amendment to NCCR 12.065 that would reflect the safety of treating cannabis with non-ionizing radiation. Now, for your benefit and review, I'd like to provide a more thorough explanation of the difference between ionizing radiation and non-ionizing radiation. The term radiation often brings to mind hazardous energy when in fact it describes all energy emission or transmission from a source in the form of a wave. Low energy frequencies such as radio waves, cell phone signals, Wi-Fi signals, magnetic fields, and visible light are all radiation, as are high energy forms such as UV lights, X-rays, and gamma rays. To distinguish between the different effects resulting from radiation, the CDC, World Health Organization, and FDA categorize all radiation as either ionizing or non-ionizing. Non-ionizing radiation is the term given to radiation in the part of the spectrum where there is insufficient energy to cause ionization, while ionizing radiation emits enough energy to remove tightly bound electrons from an atom, thus creating ions. In other words, ionizing radiation alters items on a molecular level. For the FDA, labeling is required when product has been treated with ionizing radiation. Stop this timer. Okay, the next public comment is from Karina Robinson. Welcome to the cannabis industry. Can you please tell the Nevada citizens why we are allowing lesser restrictions with radiation treatments and the Rajura symbol? This is a human consumable product. Patient and adult consumers with compromised immune systems must be informed before consumption. Mostly importantly, I'm confused. So instead of requiring and paying for growers with skill sets, instead of investing in the correct grow environments, and instead of ensuring safe and clean genetics, we are considering lowering the standards to pass more contaminated and failed material in Nevada. I'm against the symbol being removed from consumer packaging. Nevada must make the cultivation staff disclose their methods per regulations. And the third and final public comment we have is from Evan Martyr. As a cultivator and cultivation facility operator in Nevada since April 2016, it's my opinion that if a cultivator is using radiation to destroy mold on their cannabis, it is essential to list those post-harvest mold remediation techniques on all cannabis packaging being sold at the retail level. It's my opinion that the consumer should be made aware of any cannabis treated in this manner. As an organic cultivator in Nevada, we work very hard to grow clean and make sure none of our cannabis needs to be treated by any sort of mold remediation process. In 2020, out of 575 lots tested by labs here in Nevada, we had a total of 10 failures, passing rate of 98.27%. It is without question possible to pass the stringent testing requirements in Nevada without having to resort to any sort of mold remediation process. It's unfair to cultivators who employ practices to grow and produce clean cannabis to have fellow cultivators who treat their cannabis with radiation not have to disclose those practices. I'm of the strong opinion that the consumer should be made aware of cannabis products that require mold remediation treatment as opposed to those that did not. Consumers have the right to know how their products are being produced and treated, and most consumers do not understand the cultivation process. Most consumers don't know that some cultivators need to treat their cannabis with radiation in order to pass testing, and for many reasons, I feel strongly they should be made aware of this. A label on the actual packaging is optimal in achieving this, and cultivation facilities using these mold remediation techniques should definitely be required to affix a label to the outside of their packaging stating the cannabis was treated with radiation. Dr. Klimas, I'll turn it back to you.
Thanks, Ms. Bonner. Well, that concludes the business agenda items. Chair, if you had any words, you can before we adjourn.
This is Chair Douglas for the record. This workshop was helpful today. It's still kind of murky clear. I appreciate Dr. Young, Commissioner Young, chairing this subcommittee. I will be interested in hearing his comments at a later date. This is important. We do have an issue as to public safety. We also understand we don't regulate machinery and such. So we know we need to do something with this. What's there is not appropriate, so it needs to be stricken. The question is amended or just stricken. With that, I'll end.
Go ahead. Thank you, Chair. Well, thank you, everybody, for being here. Have a great day.